we had an incident at Frothley earlier, go back in time, maybe a little bit earlier last year, what have you. And the result of that was a specific domain, this domain listed below, has been added to our local watch list. So within enterprise security, you can go ahead and there's threat intelligence capabilities to pull externally, but there's also the ability to go ahead and add from internal. So we went ahead and said, well, we had an incident, this domain was part of that. Let's go ahead and add that to our watch list. So if we see any other activity, resulting with this domain being fired, I want to know about it. Pretty straightforward. Now, once you're inside enterprise security, we're going to go ahead and see a menu across the top of the screen, the far left to be like home or security posture, incident review, investigations, glass table, and then security intelligence. Click on the navigation bar for security intelligence, and then underneath that, you should see a menu item that says threat intelligence. And it has a little chevron and a little greater than sign next to it. If you click on threat intelligence, you'll see a pop-up that shows threat activity and threat artifacts. Go ahead and click on threat artifacts. And threat artifact might take a second to go ahead and load, but that's okay. As we're doing it, you should start seeing something that looks a bit like this. And then underneath that, you'll have a set of tabs that says threat overview, network, endpoint, certificate, and email. So these are different threat artifacts that have been ingested into Splunk, into enterprise security. And as you're looking through the list, I want to just go ahead and highlight that threat overview section. There's one that says local domain intel, right? So that's our locally sourced domains that maybe we've identified during our investigations, during our operations, what have you, and we're going to go ahead and put it in there. Below that are different subsets of artifacts that kind of give you a count as to how many are in these different groupings. So endpoint, email, network, and certificates. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Another thing I want to do is I want to just go ahead and focus down on those local domain intels. So up at the top of that screen, right, you can see the filters, right, threat artifact category, threat group. Let's go ahead and click on the drop down next to threat group. And underneath that, you'll see a couple of APT threat names. You'll see some emerging threats, community kinds of block lists, and you'll see one that says local domain intel. Go ahead and click on local domain intel, and then go ahead and click on submit. What'll go ahead and happen is it'll go ahead and run real quick here, and it's going to go ahead and filter down just on the indicators that are in that specific threat grouping list, okay? In which you can see here in that threat overview, there's only 2 that are showing. 2, and they came in via CSV file. Go ahead and click on network, and this just provides us a little bit more detail. So there's actually 3 sections to the network screen: the HTTP intelligence, IP, and domain. And then I just exploded it out a little bit so you can see that both the craftbrewerconference.com and the update.mdnsresponder.com are in our threat intelligence collection already as local intel. So the idea here is that and this is a little bit of the setup for the overall scenario and just some familiarization around threat indicators. But this allows us to go ahead and have our threat indicators already collected that we're aware of, that we want to go ahead and focus on, and then we go ahead and go forth with our day. That was last year, right? That was what happened before. We're hitting the fast forward button. We're hitting the jump to light speed, right? We're going back to the present. So here we are today, or August 19th, when I pulled some of this together. So what happened today is that one of our users, and as I look down the left-hand side here, I can see that the username of the system was A Grady. Okay, and this is Audrey Grady, and she is one of the Frothley employees, and she went ahead out there and appears to have issued a query via DNS to this update.mdnsresponder.com. And so you can see that over here in Stream. This is Splunk for Stream, which is wire data collection. It parses it out in a nice JSON format. You can see both the queries and the responses here. And you can see that she issued a query going out to this site, and I can see that her IP address in this and the query and the DNS server as well. On the right-hand side, I also have a sysmon from a Microsoft sysmon a log as well, showing similar information around a query going out to update MDNS responder, right? Because I have these activities now, I am now able to go ahead and correlate these events with those threat intel indicators that I've already got. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what we have. In enterprise security, across the menu and nav at the top of the screen, go ahead and click on incident review. And what will happen is the page will go ahead and load, and it will look something like this when it does load. And so you can see that I've got 36 events in my current queue right now for keeping this pretty straightforward. We're not going to go ahead and filter down on anything, but what I do want to do is I want to focus on that notable event that occurred on August 19th. And you can see that it says threat activity detected, and in parentheses it has the actual indicator that it fired on. You can see the urgency is medium, status is new, owner is unassigned. Obviously, those are things that I could go ahead and do as I go through this, but for now, let's go ahead and click on the greater than sign next to that threat activity detected. And when I do that, I get an expansion of that specific notable event right there in the screen. And then a couple of things I do want to call out here. At the top, we have the description, which is that threat activity was discovered in the query field. So there's some tokens that we've passed in there with that information. I have my destination and my source. So these are pieces around the assets themselves. Remember I talked about the incident, the asset, and the threat kind of converging. This is the place of convergence. So I have those IPs for source and destination, but I get additional contextual information to help kind of frame this up to understand, direction, owner, location, and these are extensible as well. And then on the right-hand side of the screen here, there's a couple of different places I can go to see the original correlation search to look at the activity history of people providing commentary, even be able to drill down into the data further. But I just want to highlight the original event on the right-hand side. And this kind of shows me that this was, the source to destination, the values that were associated with it, what the original source type was. So the second line from the bottom shows that this was from our DNS query is what this fired on. Go ahead and scroll down on that notable event to see more of it. This talks about the threat data that we correlated against. You can see that it came from the local domain intel group, and you could see that it was based on a query going out to that update.mdnsresponder.com, right? So that's the correlated hit that we have. Next to each one of those, inside my notable event, you'll notice there's a little triangle on the right-hand side of the column, right? So you've got here threat matched value. If I move halfway across the screen, I got update.mdnsresponder.com, and across the screen next to that, I have a drop down. If I click on that triangle, you'll notice I have a pop-up, and what this is these are what we refer to as workflow actions in Splunk. And so the workflow action itself, you can go ahead and basically pass tokenized values and push it into here. And so I could do something like I could run a Google search for that field if I wanted to. You notice I could edit tags around the values as well, but I can also go ahead and pivot over, and this is what we're going to do now, is we're going to pivot over to RiskIQ Live Investigation for that specific domain. And so really what I'm doing is I'm passing that domain into a URL, and when I go ahead and click on that, and I'm going to click on over, and it's going to actually toggle me over into the Passive Total app for RiskIQ. So again, we install this on the system, and you notice across the top bars, you have a live investigation, local investigation, search history, data enrichment, and so forth. Again, I took that value, so you shouldn't even have to put that DNS name into that top left corner where it says enter an IP or domain name, because it already happened. When you go ahead and have that in there, you'll also notice your resolution will probably spin for a second. This is an API call that's going out to RiskIQ, and it should return 58.64.184.209, the location when it was first and last seen, and the sources of data. You'll notice those boxes in the middle of the screen look pretty darn familiar, right? Because those are the different values that they're pivoting off of within the Passive Total app. And what they've done inside of the Splunk app is they've brought those capabilities across. So I could go ahead and look at certificates, and it would do a RiskIQ query for that domain and return those values directly here. So I don't have to leave the Splunk interface to go ahead and do this this threat intel research. I can do a good chunk of it right here. Let's go ahead and jump all the way over to the far right-hand side of it and click on matching events. And when I do click on matching events, what this is really doing is it's taking that domain that we had, right, and it's looking across, in this case, all time and against the index of main. And that can be configured depending on your environment and changing the time range and everything, but just to keep it simple for now, it's basically looking and says we got 3 matches for that specific domain across your data set. So it makes it very quick and easy way to go back and look at the events that are matching. And as you can see here, this is that original domain this is a new version of that domain that would have generated that hit in the first place. And if I go ahead and look at that and dig into it, you can see that I've got that update, and I'll just show it at update.com DNS query. And I can see that I've got a host address of 58.64.184.209 as part of that resolution. Okay, that happened to match up with that resolution that we saw earlier. So that there's a tie there. Go ahead and drill into the cookies tab. So go ahead at the top of the screen, click on the cookies tab. And again, what this will do is it'll go ahead and trigger an API call. It'll go out and it'll return something that should look like this, where you have, again, the host name on the far left-hand side, first seen, last seen, and then the name. And you'll see this name is, this is actually the name of the cookie, 107.58.55.392. It's very catchy. And you'll notice it also is hyperlinked. So once it does return, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go ahead and click on that cookie itself. Now at this point, we are going to pivot out to RiskIQ. So the top left-hand part of the screen, that cookie name has been pushed into the RiskIQ portal, right? I didn't have to retype that; it went in there itself on the click-through. And you'll notice that I've got both hosts and IP addresses associated with that cookie. And so my initial look is a listing of the 9 hosts that are there. So there's 9 hosts out there. One of which looks familiar, the third one down, update.mdnsresponder.com, first seen 5/29, last seen 5/29/2020, associated with that cookie. But there's 8 other domains that, quite frankly, I wasn't even aware of that had some sort of association with that one domain I did know. Let's go ahead and click on that IP address tab next to the cookie search host tab. And now here, if I look, I also see another 22 IP addresses that are associated with that cookie. And since we mentioned that 58 address, that 58 address is in that listing, and you can scroll down and see all of them that are there. In fact, it's looks like it's about halfway down the screen there, 58.64.184.209, if I recall correctly. But you can see that those IPs and host names are there, first, last seen, and so forth, all within that. So all of a sudden now I've got one domain that I knew about, but if I start looking at this, there's a whole bunch of other domains and a whole bunch of other IP addresses that are associated with that same cookie that I was not aware of before that maybe I need to do something about. So let's go ahead back over to our Splunk tab, that incident review. And this is kind of where, from a workflow perspective, I could start looking at closing this out or providing additional commentary. So, but if you wanted to, you could go ahead and click on the little box next to it. You could click edit selected, pop up with some commentary. You could go ahead and put notes in there. You could change your urgency. You could change your status. You could assign it to a specific owner. You've done that basic triage, but now you've got all this additional information about adversary infrastructure that you might want to go ahead and do something with. So what have we learned in this initial finding and then the pivot? We obviously had a domain from a previous incident or an investigation that we had. We had collected that. We had stuck it aside. We saw subsequent activity to that specific domain, both via DNS and Microsoft Sysmon. Because of that, we had a notable that we went ahead and did some investigation on. We drilled into the RiskIQ and Passive Total app and pivoted off to that to be able to see the IP and the resolution. We went ahead and pivoted into the cookie to see what other associated IPs and domains were associated with the cookie that was on that specific domain. And we were able to identify another 31, well, minus the 2 we had, basically another 29 IPs and host names that were associated with that we could go ahead and tie back into this, go ahead and provide commentary into the notable event, and then notify the proper stakeholders from there.
John, can I mention one thing? So this is looking at something that's known bad from the previous time. Like a year ago, you had this known bad, and now you're using RiskIQ to find the related pieces to this known bad, and that's where that cookie came in to say, is that cookie being used anywhere else from that known bad domain? And sure enough, it was.
Exactly. The second half of this vignette is now that, we've got a problem, right? How pervasive is this problem? Right? Because again, I can go ahead and pull that information in. I can pull these indicators in, and moving forward, much like we did with that first domain, we can be alerted to other new things that are happening. But this is kind of where I put my threat hunting hat on and start going backward and start looking back historically over time and trying to understand, when did these other things occur? Did we have these other things in our systems? Is there something that is much more long-term and pervasive that I need to go back and look for? And so that's kind of going to be the second part of this. So once we did the identification, once we have the notable, once we identify some of the other indicators for adversary infrastructure, I want to be able to hunt back in time and be able to start looking for those and understand more about what else is out there. So the 31 domains and indicators were uncovered, right? Those are including the one we had plus the IP associated with it. The questions we want to ask ourselves are, what other domains or other indicators beyond those are associated with this overall issue, right? We also know that Audrey's machine was the one that issued the DNS, right? So that is a specific system that is of concern to us. But do we know what other systems may have been impacted by this or have touched these suspicious domains and IPs? So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and walk through using enterprise security again, ingesting some threat indicators, and then going ahead and pivoting back and hunting against those. I will mention that we can do these things without Splunk Enterprise, with just Splunk Enterprise, but the process to go ahead and ingest the threat indicators would be a little bit different. So hopefully you haven't closed your Splunk tab. Hopefully you haven't closed the incident review that we were just at. That's the one we want to go ahead and start with. So let's go back to incident review. Let's go ahead and expand that specific threat activity detected event that we started with in our last vignette. And we want to open that back up again. But this time, what I want to do is, rather than go to the live investigation, I want to go back down to that threat match value, click on the update.mdns responder, and this time go ahead and click on the workflow action that says search RiskIQ threat intel for update MDNS responder. And this actually throws us to the RiskIQ website directly, but again, it takes that takes the value, the tokenized value, and puts it directly into RiskIQ like this.
And this is the new threat intel portal that RiskIQ has, that when you search for something, it will show you all of the additional open source intelligence and the enterprise indicators that are associated with this.
So at the top of the screen, right, it's you know, the customary search interface. Down below that on the left-hand side, you'll notice the passive total data summary, right? That's that resolution that we did in the first in our first vignette. Right, so I could, again, pivot down into it and do my work there directly, but I could also do that part in Splunk. The second part, a little bit farther down, you'll notice is a RiskIQ article. So here's an article that RiskIQ actually wrote that references this specific domain. So let's go ahead and scroll down to that and take a look at it. If we open it up, you'll notice that I've got the title there, I've got some additional information, I've got a description, community indicators, enterprise indicators, and we'll come back to that in a second. But I can go ahead and take a quick read through here, look and get a little bit more understanding as to what the description of this specific issue is, okay? And you guys can scroll down and take a read of that, obviously. But back up at the top there, we talked about description. Let's go ahead and click on community indicators. So you'll see here that there are 104 indicators total. There's 33 IPs associated with this, 13 hashes, 3 whois emails, and then if you scroll down further in the list, you'll also see, you should see domains there as well. And you can scroll up and scroll down. You can click on the show mores to be able to see more of them as well. Just kind of get you familiar with the information that's there. So there's a whole bunch of information that I've got here associated with this specific domain. And so maybe this is kind of the catalyst for me going, okay, let's go ahead and start searching back against our data set to say, tell me more about some of these different things, because we've seen it impacted by one indicator in here. What else do we not know about that we need to know about? One of the things I can do within the article itself is on the top right-hand side. Obviously, you can bookmark the information. You could forward or tag that as well. You could also download your indicators. If you want to go ahead and click on that download button, the down arrow with the underscore line, you could go ahead and click on that, and it'll go ahead and download the information in a CSV file. So when you output that data from RiskIQ, it comes out in a CSV format with one column describing the indicator, and the second column is the indicator, right? So domain, windowsupdating.net, IP 103.133.139.25. Pretty straightforward. There is inside of the add-on for RiskIQ, the ability to upload indicators into an index. And I show this just briefly to illustrate that that is possible. And you can do that and it works great. And you can do all sorts of things with that as well. That is one way to get the data back into Splunk. Like I said, you're certainly more than capable and able to do that, and it's called out in the documentation. The other thing that you can do, and in this example, what we're going to do is we are going to import this data back into enterprise security. Now, enterprise security has a specific file format that it wants the data to come back in. And that it's actually pretty straightforward. It's called out in the documentation, but basically there's a couple of columns, and you could do these as individual. That gets a little tedious. Instead, what I like to do is I like to put all of the indicators into one spreadsheet in this example, and you can see the email values, the IP and domain values, and the file hashes, but they just have to be in individual columns broken out with the specific names. And I did put a link there to show this. If anybody has a question about it, by all means, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk about the threat intel framework. But what it wants to do is it wants to understand that, hey, if I get a file hash, there's a specific place within our framework that it goes. And if it's an IP, there's another place it goes. So having it broken out like this in this format makes it a heck of a lot easier to get the data in one fell swoop. So what I did was basically I took the indicator list that RiskIQ had. I just kind of broke it out into separate columns like this. I put a description on it, and I called it RiskIQ Threat Intel Cookie Land, because Cookie Land was the name of the article that was associated with it. And I went ahead to configure data enrichment, threat intelligence uploads inside of enterprise security, and I went ahead and uploaded it. And again, I'm showing you this from a screenshot from a reference perspective. I'm not expecting you to do this part right now. I go ahead and specify a file name for the threat intel. I go ahead and choose the file itself. And then what I did here at the bottom was I said, let's categorize this as an APT. And again, using the article, it mentioned this as being roaming tiger. So I went ahead and classified the group as roaming tiger. These are free text fields. You can call them whatever you want to, but they become handy when I want to go back and search for my information, as well as see it in my notable events. So, make it something descriptive that you can actually, use down the road. So let's go ahead and look at our data now that we've uploaded it. Let's go ahead to security intelligence. And we're going to go to threat intelligence, threat artifacts. Same place we started our work when we were looking at that local domain threat intel. And again, that show filters, I go ahead and compress so you guys can have a little more real estate on the screen. But you'll notice in that threat overview, there is a source ID called RiskIQ-CL, right? If you recall, that is the name that I used to upload the threat intelligence. You can see if you scroll across, the source type being CSV, you can see the threat type being roaming tiger and so forth. If you scroll all the way to the far right, it'll tell you how many indicators are in that specific grouping. And then down below it, again, it tells us the overall information. Now, let's just look at the roaming tiger threat intel as a whole. So similarly, like we did before, rather than selecting local domain intel, click on the drop down next to threat group, select roaming tiger, and then click submit. This will go ahead and run, and you'll see just that one group, the Cookie Land RiskIQ group, 105. Actually, your indicators might be 104. I had one in there that I needed to suppress. I can see 13 endpoint artifacts, 3 email artifacts, 34 IPs, 55 domains in my listing. Your numbers may be just a hair different, but that's kind of the idea here, is to get a summary of those different kinds. And then let's go ahead and click on the endpoint, right? Last time we clicked on the network tab, let's click on the endpoint tab. Now on the endpoint tab, you'll notice we have a bunch of file hashes that are listed there. If I had other values like file names, extensions, path, and sizes, they could be in here as well. But again, all of this associated with roaming tiger, and this is the file intel data, just to contrast with the network data from before. Now, what we're gonna do here is we're gonna go back and we're gonna do a little hunting of indicators. So this brings up, and I mentioned this app at the very beginning when I introduced myself. This is an app that I built to kind of extend enterprise security. And the idea behind this was to be able to look at a specific asset or a specific identity and be able to pivot off of that to say, well, tell me about their network activity, tell me about their endpoint activity, tell me about their authentication activity, and so forth. What I did with this, as I was looking at this and building this out, was I actually added another dashboard to this, and I called it hunting indicators. So on your drop down at the top, go ahead and click under SA Investigator and click on the hunting indicator. And this is what the dashboard you'll see looks like. Up in the top left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see a threat group dropdown and a time range that'll default to the last 24 hours. Now that we've loaded all of these roaming tiger indicators in, that's the group I want to see, right? I want to say, hey, I've got these 100 and some indicators out there. Tell me where they are in my Splunk instance if I have them. So let's go ahead and click on the threat group roaming tiger. This is a multi-select, by the way, so if you wanted to look for multiples, you could certainly do that. But obviously, for the purpose of this, let's go ahead and focus on roaming tiger. The other thing I want to do is I want to change my time range. So by default, its time range is past 24 hours. But if I click on that drop down, I can pick a number of presets. I could go ahead and change my times. This is called a time picker for those not familiar with Splunk and Splunk Enterprise. The idea here is that everything, because it's time series data, I want to look across specific time ranges. We're going to go ahead and just select all time. We're going to look across our entire data set. Now, depending on the size of your installation, that may not be realistic, or you just may want to focus on a specific time range, and you can certainly do that with the options that are there. But go ahead and click on all time. So this is what you should have. Roaming tiger is your threat group. Time range is all time. Go ahead and click submit. Now, this will run for a little bit because what it's doing is it's looking across my entire data store, and it's using my the 100 some indicators that RiskIQ provided us. And you'll start getting these tabs returning, or these panels returning some values. Now, your panels will look a little different than the ones I'm showing you, mainly because I wanted to kind of free up some real estate on the screen to be able to show it all the way across. So that DNS answers based on an IP match is going to look a little bit different. I believe it's like a square next to an answer and a query side by side, but you can scroll side to side across it to see these values. And so in this example, and this isn't a surprise because we saw this in that notable event that we first were working on, that 5864.184.209 answer for DNS is in the indicator list, and it happens to hit our query that started this whole challenge, if you will. You can see my source address. So this is the Audrey Grady system that was compromised, or has the indicator on it, I should say. The IP of the DNS that was queried, and of course it ties to the roaming tiger threat group, and we saw one event there. On the destination IP matches, I did these as more roll-ups, mainly from a time perspective. So you can see these happened over a year ago, right? And I could see 4, 5 different IP addresses associated with an indicator of 154.216.2.135. Right there are, actually, I'm sorry, there's 5 IP addresses. There's 5 distinct IP addresses, one of which was Audrey's machine, but there's 4 other ones on top of that that have had some level of activity going out to one of those IP addresses that are listed on that list. You can see on the right-hand side here, for each one of those, this is an aggregate. So I saw a lot of events, 580, 512, 782, and so forth. So there's some actions that I probably need to take to look at those a little bit more and do a little bit more inspection. But I also can at least see here that this happened in August of 2019. If I scroll down further, you'll see that we have a panel for file execution hashes. And in this case, we saw that on August 2nd, the system of Matteo Velitis, and Velitis-L, had a process hash that matched the cookie land list. The process name itself, according to Carbon Black, because that's the EDR solution that I was running in this scenario, saw a process name of sd.exe. So sd.exe could be anything, but according to the process hash at execution, it appears to match something from the cookie land list. So that's problematic. So I need to look at Matteo's system as well. And then finally, I have some emails. Now, these are interesting because these emails are from 2020. And yes, they are who is, but conceptually, you kind of get the idea here that it looks like Mallory received an email from that email address with the subject of "from me, Gary." Now, the good news is that Mallory's was filtered as spam. Okay, and this is according to the message trace data we got from Office 365. But this other system, this Ubuntu system that we've got in AWS, whatever the heck that was, actually had it successfully delivered. So I probably want to make sure whatever that recipient address is in AWS is hopefully some sort of an analysis system and not something that somebody's actively responding to, or I might have a problem there as well. Where does this kind of leave us? Well, we were able to go ahead and take the RiskIQ data, right? We were able to pivot back and be able to find that article with these different indicators, right? We went ahead and downloaded that information, made my little format changes so I could go ahead and upload those in one fell swoop into enterprise security. Okay, so now what I can do is I can do two different things. One, for all new correlated events that are coming in, I can take those indicators and compare them to everything new coming in and say, hey, I've got something bad happening right now. But I can also then take that panel, that search that we just did, and look historically back across my data set and be able to find a lot of other kinds of badness that happen and be able to identify the systems they happen on and then prioritize my response. So at the end of the day, what do we find? Well, we found that the Frothly network communicated with 154.216.2.135 from 5 distinct addresses. We saw the Envolitis workstation based on Carbon Black have 3 process executions that matched a malicious hash. And then we saw Mallory having that email sent to her that while it was filtered with spam, the other one was delivered and it was with the subject name from Gary, right? So those things we were able to learn by being able to very quickly upload that and then look historically back across that. So to summarize that, we were able to ingest the indicators and correlate them as they came in. We pivoted back to RiskIQ to investigate, uncover additional indicators, identify additional adversary infrastructure, right? We were able to then take that additional adversary infrastructure and even more, download it back into our system and look even further back and identify things that had not been uncovered previously and be able to do our hunt with that. And we happen to do it with enterprise security, but just again, remember, you don't necessarily have to do it with enterprise security, but that's the way I wanted to show that today.
You can always reach out to success@riskiq.net or sales@splunk.com with additional questions. Thank you to Benjamin and John for a great workshop, and thank you again to GuidePoint for sponsoring. Finally, thank you to all of you for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.